In the deepest archives of the Galactic Council, buried beneath layers of classified data and, forgotten by all but one, lay a single file marked with ancient symbols that roughly translated to the Inevitability Protocol. The file contained predictions made by the last member of a species so old that even their name had been lost to time, of being known only as the Old One. Every prediction in that file had come to pass with terrifying accuracy. The rise and fall of empires, the discovery of faster-than-light travel, the great plagues that swept across star systems, and the wars that reshaped the galaxy. But there was one prediction that chilled every council member who had ever glimpsed it, a prediction about a young species from a small blue planet in an unremarkable solar system. The prediction was simple, written in the Old One's precise script: when the humans join the galactic community, you will underestimate them. You will mock their primitive technology, dismiss their violent history, and laugh at their emotional nature. You will make the same mistake every advanced civilization makes: you will judge them by your own standards. But humans are not like you. They are not like anyone. And, when the crisis comes that threatens all life in this galaxy, you will discover what I have always known: humans don't just survive the impossible, they make the impossible their weapon. The file was sealed again, its contents dismissed as the ramblings of an extinct species. After all, what could primitive humans possibly do that the combined might of 1,000 advanced civilizations could not? The Old One had been dead for millennia, but if they could have smiled, they would have. The humans were coming, and the galaxy had no idea what it was about to witness. The Galactic Council chamber hummed with the low vibration of 1,000 different breathing patterns, each representing a species that had clawed its way to the stars through logic, calculation, and careful advancement. Ambassador Zethkri of the Valerian Empire adjusted his crystalline breathing apparatus and watched with barely concealed amusement as the newest applicants to the council shuffled forward. Humans. The word itself seemed almost comical when spoken in the refined tones of galactic standard. They stood before the assembled representatives like children who had wandered into a university lecture hall, their soft flesh barely contained by primitive environmental suits, their eyes darting nervously between the towering forms of beings whose civilizations had been crossing the void when Earth was still cooling from its formation. "State your species designation and claim to council membership," intoned High Arbiter Quellen, her 6 arms creating an elegant pattern that humans couldn't even begin to interpret. The translation devices built into their suits would convert her words, but they would miss the subtle layers of meaning that any civilized being would understand. The lead human, a female designated as Ambassador Sarah Chin according to the files, stepped forward with what the psychological profiles had labeled as characteristic human stubbornness. Her voice came through the chamber's speakers with that peculiar flat quality that marked species who had never learned to communicate across multiple dimensional frequencies. "I am Ambassador Sarah Chen, representing the United Earth Coalition. We claim membership through our achievement of faster-than-light travel and our peaceful contact with your survey teams." A ripple of what might charitably be called laughter passed through the chamber. The Kethmoran delegate actually had to cover his breathing slits to contain his amusement. Faster-than-light travel. These humans spoke of it as if it were some grand achievement, when every species in this chamber had mastered it centuries before achieving true sentience. Zethkri accessed his species' database on human development. Chemical rockets. Nuclear weapons used against their own kind. Wars fought over lines drawn on maps of their single planet. A species that had only recently stopped killing each other in massive conflicts and somehow believed they were ready to join civilizations that had transcended such primitive behavior millennia ago. "And what," Arbiter Quellen continued with the patient tone reserved for speaking to small children, "does your species offer to the galactic community? What unique capabilities justify your inclusion among us?" Ambassador Chan's jaw tightened in what human body language indicated was determination, though to most of the assembled beings it looked like a muscle spasm. "We offer our perspective, our innovation, and our commitment to peaceful exploration of the galaxy." Innovation. From a species that had barely learned to split the atom without destroying themselves. Perspective from beings who had never known life beyond a single world until a few decades ago. The assembled council members exchanged glances that clearly communicated their thoughts without need for words. But, in the deepest levels of the council archives, something stirred. Not literally, of course. The Old One had been dead for longer than some species had existed. But their final message, sealed away and nearly forgotten, contained algorithms that activated only under specific conditions. The arrival of humanity triggered those conditions. Deep in the archive cores, data began to flow. Ancient predictions cross-referenced with current events. Analysis protocols that had been dormant for millennia suddenly sparked to life. And, in the central processing unit that had been built around the old one's final consciousness upload, something that might have been recognition flickered. The humans were here, right on schedule. Above, the council debate continued with predictable results. The Throne Key representative questioned why a species that still used projectile weapons should be considered advanced enough for membership. The Zilton delegate wondered aloud if humanity had even mastered basic genetic manipulation, given their obvious physical limitations. Ambassador Chen fielded each question with admirable composure. Those Ethcre's thermal sensors detected the stress indicators common to mammals under pressure. Elevated heart rate, increased perspiration, microtremors in the extremities. How these creatures had ever survived their own planet's apparently hostile evolution was beyond comprehension. Your species, declared Counselor Vextharn of the Hive Collectives, his chitinous form clicking with each word, shows promise but lacks the fundamental advancement necessary for full membership. We propose a probationary status. You may observe our proceedings and learn from civilized beings. Perhaps in a few centuries, when you have evolved beyond your current primitive state, we can revisit this application. The other humans in the delegation shifted uncomfortably. Their faces, so easy to read compared to properly evolved beings, showed disappointment, frustration, and, in some cases, barely contained anger. But Ambassador Chen simply nodded. We accept your decision, she said, her voice steady despite the obvious biological stress responses. We look forward to learning from your wisdom. As the humans filed out of the chamber, followed by the amused murmurs of the assembled council members, none of them noticed the subtle energy fluctuations deep below their feet. The old one's systems were running calculations, cross-referencing human behavior patterns with predictions made before their star had been born. Everything was proceeding exactly as foreseen. 3 levels down, in the xenobiology section, Dr. Kethran was reviewing the human medical data that had been provided as part of their application. As the Council's leading expert on primitive species development, he found the human physiology fascinating in its inefficiency. Look at this, he called to his research partner, Dr. Zilden. Their cardiovascular system requires constant maintenance. Their skeletal structure is riddled with weaknesses. They don't even have proper radiation shielding in their cellular structure. How did natural selection produce something so obviously flawed? Dr. Zilden extended her sensory tendrils to examine the data. Perhaps their planet lacks the environmental pressures necessary for proper evolution. Notice how their muscle fibers are arranged for explosive movement rather than efficiency. And their neural development patterns suggest they waste enormous amounts of energy on what they call emotions. Emotions, Dr. Kethran repeated with the tone one might use to discuss a quaint but ultimately pointless custom. Chemical reactions that interfere with logical decision-making. No wonder they're still confined to a single world. Neither scientist noticed the subtle probe that had been monitoring their conversation, or the way their words were being carefully catalogued and filed away in archives that hadn't been accessed since before their civilizations had discovered fire. Meanwhile, Ambassador Chan and her delegation had been assigned quarters in the diplomatic section of the council station. The accommodations were adequate, if clearly designed for beings whose needs were considered basic compared to more advanced species. As she sat in her temporary office, reviewing the day's proceedings, Chin couldn't shake the feeling that they had been judged long before stepping into that chamber. Her aide, Commander Jackson, knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a human custom that would have been considered barbarically informal by council standards. Ma'am, we're getting reports from the other human vessels in the system. The council security forces have been conducting what they call routine inspections of our ships. Chen looked up from her reports. Inspections of what? Everything. Our weapons systems, our computer cores, our crew quarters. They seem particularly interested in our military protocols and tactical databases. Standard procedure for new applicants, I'm sure, Chen said, though her tone suggested she didn't entirely believe it. Maybe. But, according to Captain Rodriguez on the Wellington, their inspectors seemed surprised by some of our ship designs. Apparently, our approach to engineering doesn't match what they expected from a primitive species. Chen set down her tablet and walked to the viewport that looked out onto the massive council station. Ships from dozens of species moved through the docking bays with the coordinated precision of a well-rehearsed dance. Each vessel was a masterwork of engineering, sleek and efficient, designed by civilizations that had had centuries to perfect their technology. Human ships, by comparison, looked almost crude. Bulky, heavily armored, with redundant systems and what the council engineers had called excessive structural reinforcement. But, as Chen watched a council patrol ship glide past her window, she found herself wondering if their efficiency came at a cost. What would happen if one of those elegant vessels faced a problem that couldn't be solved through standard protocols? Deep in the archive levels, the old one's systems recorded her thoughts, captured by sensors that could read biological electrical patterns from kilometers away. Another data point confirmed. Another prediction validated. The humans were reacting exactly as anticipated. That night, as the council station dimmed its lighting to simulate the day-night cycles of various member worlds, the human delegation gathered in their common area. It was a distinctly human custom, this need to gather, to share experiences, to process events through social interaction rather than individual meditation or data analysis. Commander Martinez, the delegation's military advisor, was expressing what several others were thinking but were too diplomatic to say aloud. They're treating us like primitives who somehow stumbled onto spaceflight by accident. In their defense, Dr. Elizabeth Wright, the delegation's science advisor, said with the careful tone of someone trying to remain objective, "We are relatively new to interstellar travel compared to them. Most of these civilizations have been spacefaring for thousands of years." "New, maybe, but not stupid," Martinez replied. "I've seen their technical specifications. Their ships are impressive, but they're designed for a specific type of operation. Peaceful exploration, scientific research, diplomatic missions. What happens when they face something that doesn't respond to reason and careful planning?" Ambassador Chen listened to the conversation while reviewing the cultural profiles of the major council species. Each had achieved interstellar flight through gradual technological progression. Each had evolved past what they considered the primitive stages of development, competition, aggression, territorial disputes. They had become rational, logical, efficient. They had also become predictable. "Ma'am?" Commander Jackson noticed her distraction. "Thoughts?" Chen closed the cultural files and looked around at her team. They were young by diplomatic standards, chosen not just for their expertise but for their ability to adapt to unprecedented situations. Each had been briefed on the possibility that humanity's first contact with galactic civilization might not go smoothly. None of them had been prepared for the condescension. "I think," Chen said carefully, "that they're making assumptions about us based on their own developmental paths. They see a young, aggressive species and assume we'll follow the same trajectory they did." "And if we don't?" Dr. Wright asked. Chen looked back out at the viewport, where the lights of the massive station reflected off the hulls of countless alien vessels. Somewhere out there, in the vast darkness between stars, were threats that these advanced civilizations had never had to face. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and peace and logic were luxuries that only existed when someone else was willing to fight for them. Then, they're going to be very surprised. In the deepest levels of the station, ancient systems completed another round of calculations. The old one's predictions were unfolding with mechanical precision. Phase 1 was complete. The humans had been assessed, categorized, and dismissed. Now came the interesting part. 6 months after humanity's probationary admission to the Galactic Council, the first reports began filtering in from the Outer Rim territories. Ships were disappearing. Not just any ships, council vessels, with their advanced shielding and sophisticated defense systems, were vanishing without a trace from sectors that had been considered completely safe for centuries. High Arbiter Quellen reviewed the latest intelligence briefings with growing concern. The Valerian research vessel Crystalline Dawn had been investigating unusual energy readings near the Helix Nebula when contact was lost. 3 days later, the Kethmoran diplomatic cruiser Sacred Harmony had gone silent while conducting routine negotiations with a minor world in the same sector. Now, the heavily shielded Zilton exploration ship Enlightened Path had failed to report in from what should have been a simple mapping mission. Mechanical failures? Arbiter Quellen asked the assembled intelligence committee. Negative, replied Intelligence Director Vexclon, his artificial vocal cords producing the flat, emotionless tone that his species had adopted after transcending biological limitations. All three vessels had recently completed full maintenance cycles. Their systems were operating at peak efficiency when they were lost. Hostile action by unknown forces? Possible, but unlikely. Long-range sensors detected no weapon signatures, no energy discharges consistent with known military technology. The ships simply ceased to exist. Arbiter Quellen's four primary arms created a complex gesture that indicated deep thoughtfulness combined with mild frustration. In the 2,000 years since the Council had established dominance over this sector of the galaxy, such mysterious disappearances were virtually unheard of. Conflicts were resolved through negotiation. Unknown species were contacted through careful diplomatic protocols. The galaxy had become a civilized place where problems could be solved through reason and superior technology. Deploy additional surveillance networks to the affected sectors, she ordered. Double the sensor coverage and establish automated monitoring stations. Whatever is causing these disappearances will reveal itself through logical analysis. What the Council didn't know was that their missing ships hadn't simply vanished. They had encountered something that their rational, peaceful mindset couldn't comprehend, a species that had evolved in the deepest parts of space, far from any star's warmth, feeding on energy itself and viewing all other life forms as nothing more than convenient power sources. The Devourers, as they had come to be known in the Old One's ancient records, were not a species in any sense that the Council would recognize. They were something far worse, a collective intelligence that consumed entire civilizations not for territory or resources, but simply because organic and electronic life generated the specific type of energy they required for survival. They had been dormant for millennia, waiting in the void between galaxies. But something had awakened them, drawn them back to this sector of space where life had flourished in their absence. They moved through space like a plague, invisible to conventional sensors until the moment they struck. And they had just discovered that this galaxy was populated by countless species whose advanced technology made them incredibly efficient energy sources. The first major attack came 2 weeks later. The Council world of Serenity Prime was the jewel of the inner systems, a planet that had been transformed over centuries into a perfect example of advanced civilization. The population of 12 billion lived in harmony with their environment, their cities powered by clean fusion reactors, their society governed by rational consensus and logical planning. The Devourers hit Serenity Prime at what the inhabitants called midday, though the artificial suns that illuminated their world maintained constant optimal lighting conditions. There was no warning, no energy signature, no indication that anything was wrong until the planet's power grid began fluctuating. At first, the technical staff assumed it was a minor malfunction in the distribution network. Such issues were rare but not unheard of, and the automated repair systems would correct any problems within minutes. But, instead of stabilizing, the fluctuations grew worse. Power plants began shutting down one by one, not from damage but from a complete drain of their energy reserves. Fusion reactors that should have operated for centuries found their fuel somehow depleted in minutes. The backup systems activated, then died. Emergency power supplies lasted barely seconds before they too were mysteriously emptied. In the space of an hour, a civilization that had existed in perfect technological harmony for over 1,000 years was plunged into darkness. But the power hadn't simply disappeared. It had been consumed by creatures that existed in a state between energy and matter, beings that fed on the electrical impulses of living brains and the quantum fluctuations of advanced technology. As the cities of Serenity Prime went dark, the Devourers grew stronger, their hunger awakening after countless eons of dormancy. The distress signal from Serenity Prime reached the council chambers just as Ambassador Chen was attending her first official council session as a probationary observer. She sat in the designated area for non-voting members, carefully taking notes and trying to understand the complex political dynamics between species that had been interacting for centuries. The session was discussing trade regulations for exotic matter when Director Vexclon burst through the chamber doors with a level of urgency that violated every protocol of civilized discourse. "High Arbiter," he called out, his artificial voice crackling with interference, "we have received an emergency transmission from Serenity Prime. The entire planetary power grid has failed. 12 billion lives are in immediate danger." The chamber erupted in a cacophony of sounds as dozens of species tried to express shock, disbelief, and concern in their native languages. Ambassador Chen had been studying galactic history during her probationary period, and she knew that Serenity Prime was considered one of the most stable and advanced worlds in Council territory. "How can an entire planetary grid fail?" demanded Councillor Threndar of the engineering guilds. "Our fusion technology is foolproof. The redundant systems alone should have prevented any cascading failures." "That's what makes this so unprecedented," Director Vexclon replied. "According to the emergency transmission, it wasn't a failure. The energy was somehow drained. Consumed. The quantum signatures suggest that something was actively feeding on their power systems." High Arbiter Quellen rose to her full imposing height, her 6 arms creating patterns that commanded absolute attention. "Feeding? What kind of phenomenon could consume the energy output of an entire planet?" Chen found herself leaning forward, her human instincts picking up on something that the more advanced beings seemed to be missing. The pattern of disappearing ships, now a planet drained of power, it suggested a predator of some kind, something that hunted energy rather than matter. "High Arbiter," she called out, rising from her seat in the observer section. The entire chamber turned to look at her, and Chen could see the mixture of surprise and annoyance on the faces of beings who still considered humans barely advanced enough to observe their proceedings, let alone contribute to them. "You have something to add, Ambassador Chen?" Arbiter Quellen's tone suggested that any interruption from a probationary member should be brief and relevant. "The pattern of attacks suggests a predatory species," Chen said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "Something that feeds on energy rather than matter. On my world, we have creatures that follow migration patterns, appearing in one area, consuming available resources, then moving on to the next." Councillor Vextharn of the Hive Collectives made a dismissive clicking sound. "Ambassador Chen, we appreciate your primitive perspective, but we are dealing with advanced technology and quantum-level energy manipulation. This is not comparable to your planet's biological systems. With respect, Counselor, energy is energy. Whether it's stored in biological tissue or fusion reactors, if something has evolved to consume it, the behavior patterns would be similar. Hunt, feed, move to the next source." Dr. Kethran, who had been monitoring the discussion from the scientific advisory panel, activated his communication interface. "The human may have a point, though her reasoning is overly simplistic. If we are dealing with an unknown species that has developed energy consumption capabilities, it would represent an entirely new category of threat." "Unknown species," High Arbiter Quellen repeated thoughtfully. "Director Vexclon, have our deep space monitoring arrays detected any signs of non-council vessels in the affected sectors?" "Negative, High Arbiter. Our sensors can detect any known form of propulsion, any conventional materials, any energy signatures associated with space travel. Whatever is causing these attacks is either using technology beyond our understanding or it's not using technology at all," Chen interrupted, then immediately looked apologetic for speaking out of turn. "I mean, what if it's biological? Or something between biological and technological that we haven't encountered before?" The chamber fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Every species in the Council had achieved advancement through technology, through the application of reason and scientific principles to overcome the limitations of biology. The concept of something that existed outside those parameters was almost incomprehensible. But, in the deepest levels of the station, the Old One's archived systems were processing the conversation, comparing it to predictions made eons ago. The humans were reacting exactly as anticipated, seeing patterns that more advanced civilizations missed precisely because of their advancement. The Devourers were an old enemy, one that the Old One's species had fought and barely defeated countless millennia ago. They were not biological in any conventional sense, nor were they technological. They were something far more dangerous, a form of life that had evolved to exploit the very advances that other species considered their greatest achievements. And they had returned just as the Old One had predicted they would, drawn by the energy signatures of a galaxy full of advanced civilizations whose technology made them perfect prey. High Arbiter Quellen was about to respond to Chen's suggestion when another emergency signal reached the chamber. This time it was from the Council's military command. "High Arbiter," the voice of Admiral Cresthon crackled through the communication system, "we have a problem. The rescue fleet we dispatched to Serenity Prime has gone dark. All 12 ships, including the flagship Eternal Vigilance, stopped responding to communications 17 minutes ago." The chamber erupted again, but this time the sounds were different. Fear, Chen realized. For the first time since arriving at the Council, she was seeing genuine fear from beings who had believed themselves beyond such primitive emotions. "How is that possible?" demanded Counselor Threndar. "The Eternal Vigilance carries enough firepower to pacify an entire star system. Its shields can withstand direct stellar radiation." "Unknown, sir. Long-range sensors show the ships are still there, still intact, but they're not responding to any communications and their energy signatures are diminished." Chen stood again, and this time no one tried to interrupt her. "High Arbiter, permission to address the Council?" There was a long pause as Quellen considered the unprecedented request. Finally, she gestured for Chen to continue. "In human military doctrine, when facing an unknown enemy, the first priority is to gather intelligence without engaging directly. Sending large, heavily armed fleets against an enemy that seems to specialize in draining energy might be giving them exactly what they want." "And what would you suggest?" Admiral Cresthon's voice held a note of skepticism even through the communication system. Chen took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would sound like madness to beings accustomed to overwhelming technological superiority. "Small, fast ships. Minimal energy signatures. Hit-and-run tactics to probe their capabilities without presenting major targets." She paused, then added, "and weapons that don't depend on energy. Kinetic projectiles, chemical explosives, physical impact weapons." The silence that followed was profound. Chen had just suggested abandoning millennia of military evolution and returning to what the Council considered primitive warfare. But, in the archives below, ancient systems hummed with satisfaction. The humans were following the script perfectly, proposing exactly the solutions that the Old One had known they would develop. The real test was about to begin. 3 days after Ambassador Chan's unconventional suggestions, the Council faced a reality that shattered their fundamental understanding of galactic warfare. 7 more worlds had gone dark, their populations helpless as the Devourers drained every source of energy from their civilizations. Worse yet, every military response had failed catastrophically, with advanced fleets being reduced to powerless hulks drifting in space. High Arbiter Quellen stood before the emergency session of the Council, her elegant form betraying none of the desperation that thermal sensors would have detected in any of the human observers. The assembled representatives of 100 civilizations waited in tense silence as she addressed what was rapidly becoming an existential crisis. "The situation has deteriorated beyond our initial assessments," she began, her 6 arms creating patterns of grim determination. "Our most advanced military assets have proven ineffective against this enemy. Our scientists cannot explain how entire fleets lose power without any detectable weapon signatures. Our evacuation efforts are failing because the enemy can drain our transport ships faster than we can rescue populations." Counselor Vextharn of the Hive Collectives rose from his position, chitinous plates clicking with agitation. "High Arbiter, with respect, we may need to consider options previously deemed unacceptable. Perhaps it is time to deploy the planet cracker devices, sterilize the affected sectors before this plague spreads further." A ripple of shock passed through the chamber. The planet crackers were weapons of last resort, capable of destabilizing entire star systems but requiring enormous amounts of energy to operate. In the current situation, they would likely become feeding sources for the very enemy they were meant to destroy. "Counselor Vextharn," came a voice from the probationary section, "may I address that suggestion?" Every being in the chamber turned to look at Ambassador Chen, who had risen from her observer's seat with the calm determination that had begun to characterize her interventions. over the past few days, her contributions had shifted from politely ignored to reluctantly considered. The fact that her unconventional thinking had predicted several aspects of the crisis was beginning to earn her a grudging respect. "Speak, Ambassador," High Arbiter Quellen said, her tone suggesting that traditional protocol was becoming less important than practical solutions. "Planet crackers require massive energy generation to function. If these devourers, as I've started thinking of them, can drain the power from entire fleets, giving them access to planet-destroying levels of energy could make them exponentially more dangerous." Dr. Kethran, monitoring from the scientific panel, activated his communication interface. "The human logic is sound. We've observed that each attack seems to strengthen the enemy. Providing them with more powerful energy sources could accelerate their expansion rate beyond our ability to contain them. Then, what do you propose?" Admiral Cresthon's voice carried the weight of a military commander who had watched his finest ships become helpless derelicts. "Our entire technological advantage has been neutralized. Our energy weapons are useless. Our shields provide no protection. We're facing an enemy that turns our own capabilities against us." Chen looked around the chamber, seeing fear and confusion on faces belonging to beings whose species had never known defeat. They had become so advanced, so dependent on their technology, that they had forgotten how to fight without it. "Admiral, how long would it take to retrofit a small fleet with purely kinetic weapons and chemical propulsion?" The question caused a stir throughout the chamber. Chemical propulsion hadn't been used by Council species in centuries, considered hopelessly primitive compared to their clean, efficient energy-based systems. Chemical propulsion? Admiral Cresthon's disbelief was evident even through the communication system. "Ambassador, you're talking about technology that most of our species abandoned before achieving interstellar flight. Technology that doesn't generate the energy signatures these creatures seem attracted to," Chen replied. "Look at the pattern of their attacks. They've hit our most advanced, most energy-rich targets first. The research vessels, the military flagships, the core worlds with their massive power grids. They're drawn to energy like." She paused, searching for an analogy that would make sense to beings who had never experienced biological hunger, like plants growing toward light. Commander Martinez, who had been quietly observing from the human delegation area, stood and cleared his throat. "If I may add to Ambassador Chen's point," he said, his military bearing evident even in the formal council setting, human military doctrine includes extensive training in degraded technology scenarios. Fighting when your advanced systems have been compromised or destroyed. And, you believe this primitive approach could be effective against an enemy that has neutralized our most sophisticated weapons? Counselor Threndar's tone suggested he found the idea almost insulting. "Sir, sometimes the most sophisticated answer isn't the right answer," Martinez replied. "If your enemy has evolved to counter advanced technology, you don't beat them with more advanced technology. You beat them with something they haven't adapted to handle." Deep in the station's archives, the old one's ancient systems processed every word of the conversation, comparing it to predictions that had been made before human civilization existed. Everything was unfolding according to the pattern, the inevitable result of humanity's unique evolutionary path. While other species had evolved past conflict through technological superiority, humans had evolved through conflict itself. They had learned to fight with sticks and stones, then metal and gunpowder, then nuclear weapons and guided missiles. Each level of advancement had been built on the foundation of earlier, simpler methods, and they had never truly abandoned any of them. More importantly, they had never lost the mental flexibility that came from being a young species still learning to survive. High Arbiter Quellen was silent for a long moment, her 4 secondary arms performing calculations on a holographic interface while her primary arms maintained the formal posture of deep consideration. Finally, she spoke. "Admiral Cresthon, how quickly could you assemble a volunteer force willing to operate with simplified technology?" High Arbiter, with respect, asking Council military personnel to abandon their training and equipment would be Admiral, Chin interrupted gently, "You wouldn't need to ask Council personnel. The human ships in this system are already equipped with kinetic weapons and chemical backup propulsion. We designed them that way because we couldn't afford the energy requirements of your more advanced systems." The chamber fell silent as the implications became clear. The humans, dismissed as primitives with inefficient technology, were the only ones present with ships specifically designed to operate without the advanced energy systems that the Devourers seemed to feed on. You're suggesting, High Arbiter Quellen said slowly, that humanity should lead a military response against an enemy that has defeated the combined might of the Council? I'm suggesting that we're the only ones here equipped to try, Chen replied. Our ships are too primitive to be attractive targets. Our weapons don't rely on the energy systems they drain. And, our military thinking isn't constrained by centuries of assuming that more advanced always means more effective. Admiral Cresthon's voice came through the communication system with a mixture of desperation and hope. How many ships could you deploy? Commander Martinez consulted his tactical display. The human fleet in this system consists of 47 vessels of various classes. Not much compared to a Council battle fleet, but designed for extended operations with minimal support. 47 ships against an enemy that destroy 200 of our most advanced vessels, Councillor Vextharn observed. The mathematics are not encouraging. The mathematics change when your weapons can actually damage the enemy, Martinez replied. A kinetic projectile traveling at significant velocity doesn't care about energy shields or power drains. It just hits, and keeps hitting until something breaks. Dr. Wright, the human science advisor, activated her display interface. I've been analyzing the energy patterns from the attacks. If I'm reading the data correctly, these Devourers exist in a state that's partially outside normal spacetime. Energy weapons pass through them or get absorbed, but physical matter should interact normally. Should, Dr. Kethran noted. You're proposing to risk lives based on theoretical interactions with a completely unknown form of life. Dr. Ambassador Chen said quietly, we're already losing lives. Billions of them. Sometimes you have to risk everything on a theory because the alternative is certain extinction. High Arbiter Quellen looked around the chamber, seeing the faces of representatives whose civilizations had never faced a threat they couldn't analyze, understand, and defeat through superior technology. For the first time in millennia, the Council was confronting an enemy that made their advancement a liability rather than an asset. Ambassador Chen, are you formally requesting Council authorization for a human-led military response? Chen stood and faced the High Arbiter directly. I am requesting authorization for a joint response, with human ships providing the primary attack capability and Council ships providing intelligence, logistics, and evacuation support. This isn't about humans proving superiority over more advanced species. This is about using the right tool for the job. And, if you fail? Chen's expression grew grim. Then, at least we'll know whether kinetic weapons can damage them. That's more intelligence than anyone has right now. The vote, when it came, was closer than Chen had expected. Several species abstained, unwilling to endorse what they saw as a desperate gamble with primitive technology. But, the mounting casualties and the complete failure of conventional responses had created a willingness to try anything. Admiral Cresthon's voice crackled through the communication system with new energy. Ambassador Chen, Commander Martinez, you have Council authorization to proceed. What do you need from us? Detailed intelligence on the enemy positions, real-time communication support, and medical facilities for casualties, Martinez replied immediately. And, Admiral? Keep your energy signatures to minimum levels. We don't want to attract their attention until we're ready. As the human delegation prepared to leave the Council chambers, High Arbiter Quellen approached Ambassador Chen privately. Ambassador, I must ask, do your people truly believe this approach will succeed, or are you simply the only ones willing to attempt what others consider impossible? Chen paused, considering the question. In the weeks since arriving at the Council station, she had seen the results of civilizations that had optimized themselves for peace, efficiency, and rational progress. They had created wonders beyond human imagination, achieved harmony that humanity could barely dream of. They had also become predictable. High Arbiter, there's an old human saying, when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. For thousands of years, your species have been developing more sophisticated hammers. But, sometimes the problem isn't a nail. Sometimes you need a completely different approach. And, if your different approach fails? Chen looked out through the chamber's viewing ports at the stars beyond, knowing that somewhere in that darkness, ancient predators were feeding on the energy of advanced civilizations. Then, we'll try another approach. And another. And another. That's what humans do, we keep trying until something works or there's nothing left to try. As the human fleet prepared for what might be the most important battle in galactic history, deep in the station's archives, the Old One's final message played once more: they will judge humans by their own standards and find them wanting. They will see primitive technology and assume primitive thinking. They will mistake adaptability for weakness, versatility for inefficiency. And, when the crisis comes that threatens all life in the galaxy, they will discover what I have always known: humans don't just survive the impossible, they make the impossible their weapon. The Devourers were about to learn why some species survived by becoming more advanced, while others survived by never forgetting how to fight with rocks and sticks. And, in the vast darkness between stars, ancient predators were about to meet the galaxy's newest apex species, one that had never learned to accept that anything was truly impossible.